It looked like a perfect locked room.
The door was bolted from the inside. The windows were shut tight. No signs of a struggle, and nothing was missing. And yet, inside that room, a body lay on the floor. The night before, the man had been in bed, watching a movie, snacking and smoking, an ordinary evening in every way. But by the next morning, he was found face down on the carpet, completely motionless. No intruder, no screams, not even a cause of death that made sense. Later, the case would be described as one of the most baffling locked room deaths in Texas. The story begins on Thursday, September 16th, 2010. Early that morning, Susie, just like she did every day, called her husband, oil and gas industry professional Greg Flanagan. But this time, there was no answer. At first, Susie assumed he was still asleep. Yet after several more calls went unanswered, something that had never happened before, she felt a chill of unease. She phoned Greg's company only to hear the last thing she expected. Greg hadn't shown up for work at all. A man who was always on time, never late, had suddenly vanished. Susie immediately asked two of Greg's co-workers to go check on him at the hotel where he stayed during the work week, while she herself left home and headed toward the room that was about to unravel everything. Greg had been staying at the MCM Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. The two co-workers arrived outside room 348 and knocked for a long time. No response. They fetched the hotel manager, who opened the door with a master key. The lock was intact, with no signs of damage or forced entry. The room felt stuffy, and the TV was still on. But the moment their eyes dropped to the floor, everyone's expression changed. Greg was lying face down on the carpet beside the bed, completely motionless. No matter how they called his name, he didn't respond. It took them a few stunned seconds to understand what they were seeing. Then they called 911. Police arrived at the hotel within minutes. Greg's room wasn't large. As you walked in, the bathroom was immediately on the right. Farther in, a TV sat on a dresser to the left, and a double bed was positioned on the right. Greg was lying face down on the carpet at the corner of the bed, closer to the bathroom side. He was still in his pajamas. His face was turned down toward the floor, and a cigarette was wedged between the fingers of his left hand. At first glance, there were no obvious injuries, only a faint abrasion on his face. From the scene alone, it looked like he might have been half reclining on the bed, watching TV, smoking, and snacking, when something happened and he fell off the mattress, scraping his face as he went down. At the far end of the room was the window, latched from the inside. A pair of jeans lay on the floor. In the pocket was Greg's wallet, cash untouched, not a dollar missing. The room showed no signs of a struggle. Nothing appeared overturned or out of place, and the door lock was intact with no evidence of forced entry. Investigators quickly ruled out a break-in or robbery, but what really happened, and why, would have to wait for the medical examiner's report. Greg was 55 years old and lived in Lafayette, Louisiana, about a 2-hour drive from Beaumont, Texas. Every Monday, he would leave home and drive to Beaumont for work. From Monday through Thursday nights, he stayed at the MCM Elegante Hotel in room 348, then drove back home after work on Friday to reunite with his wife. He was known as a hard worker and not much of a social person. Most nights, he preferred to return to his room alone, light a cigarette, turn on the TV, and unwind in quiet. In Susie's eyes, her husband wasn't the healthiest man, but he always seemed strong, steady, and full of energy. She never imagined he could be gone just like that. And in the early stages of the investigation, everything pointed to one simple explanation: a sudden, natural death. The room was locked from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle. It looked like Greg had been smoking, watching TV, and then, without warning, collapsed. It fit the picture of a sudden medical emergency. Susie's own statement seemed to support that theory. She said Greg rarely, if ever, went for checkups. When he got sick, he didn't like seeing a doctor. He never exercised, and he'd smoked for most of his life, to the point where he often had a persistent cough. And when it came to drinking, he did it on his own terms, whenever he felt like it. To investigators, it sounded like years of unhealthy habits had finally caught up with him. Susie was devastated. But at first, she accepted that conclusion. But then the autopsy report came back, and it turned the entire case on its head. The medical examiner noted a small tear in Greg's private area, and inside, the damage was far worse: severe internal trauma that seemed to track upward, reaching all the way to his heart. That kind of injury couldn't be explained by a sudden illness. It looked less like a medical emergency, and more like the result of a violent impact. And yet there was a major problem. If someone had beaten him with a blunt object, there should have been bruises, swelling, broken skin, something visible on the outside. But Greg's body showed almost none. The examiner was highly experienced, with decades on the job, and even he admitted he had never seen a case like this. In the end, with no clearer explanation, he could only classify it as unexplained blunt force trauma, suggesting the unusual tear might have been caused by a kick. But as for why the outside of Greg's body looked so strangely clean, even the examiner couldn't explain it. And that was the moment everything changed. Police immediately reclassified the death as a homicide and reopened the investigation from the ground up. And here's what made it even stranger. Beaumont was considered a relatively quiet city. Murders weren't common there. Yet Greg's death was easily one of the most baffling cases in years. That night, nearby guests reported no screaming, no crash, no loud disturbance. The room itself looked neat and untouched. So one terrifying question surfaced. Was Greg attacked somewhere else, and then secretly brought back into room 348? Police started by looking at the most obvious person: Susie, Greg's wife. But Susie and Greg were deeply devoted to each other. She had no motive, and more importantly, no opportunity. On the night Greg died, she was back home in Lafayette, nowhere near Beaumont. So investigators asked the next question. Had Greg made an enemy in Beaumont? They interviewed his co-workers, but everyone described the same man: dependable, kind, and well-liked. Greg focused on work, treated people respectfully, and didn't seem to have business conflicts. And his routine in Beaumont was almost boring: hotel to office, office to hotel. He didn't go out drinking, didn't socialize, didn't pick fights. Most nights, he stayed alone in his room until morning. If someone had targeted him, it didn't make much sense. Just as the investigation began to stall, a hotel maintenance record delivered a new lead. According to the log, on the night Greg died, he called the front desk to report an electrical problem. He told staff that while he was heating popcorn in the microwave, he accidentally caused a short circuit. And it wasn't a small issue. Power went out not only in room 348, but also in the neighboring room 349 and even room 248 downstairs. The hotel sent a maintenance worker into Greg's room, making him the only confirmed person known to have entered the scene before the death was discovered. But the worker said he fixed the problem and left around 8:30 p.m. Surveillance footage and front desk witnesses backed up his timeline, and he even passed a polygraph. In the end, police ruled him out. With the maintenance worker cleared, attention shifted next door. In room 349 were two electricians, Lance Meller and Tim Steinmetz, long-term guests employed at a nearby refinery. That night, they had invited a third co-worker over, and the three of them were drinking together. Suddenly, losing power could easily have disrupted the party, and that raised an unsettling possibility. Did the blackout, the alcohol, and the irritation push them to confront Greg, leading to a fatal argument next door? Surprisingly, when police tracked down the three electricians, they acted as if they knew nothing about what had happened next door. They said that after the power outage, they went downstairs to the hotel bar to keep drinking, and other customers there backed up that story. Then, around midnight, the three men left the bar, and as they walked past room 348, they claimed they heard someone coughing inside. After that, they said they didn't hear anything else. During questioning, all three were cooperative. So cooperative, in fact, that they even offered to stay at the hotel until police cleared everything up. And at the time, investigators believed them. But day after day, the case went nowhere. Greg's family sank into helplessness. They offered a $50,000 reward for anyone with information, yet nothing came of it. If no new lead surfaced, the case could easily fade into a cold case, unsolved, forgotten. Susie was desperate. She tried everything, even considered suing the hotel to put pressure on the investigation. But nothing worked. Eventually, Greg's body was cremated, and just as it seemed the case would be sealed away as an unsolved mystery, a lawyer friend gave Susie one last suggestion. Call a Florida-based private investigator named Brennan. Brennan wasn't an ordinary PI. He was a veteran investigator, known in the industry as a cold case specialist. People said that when he got involved, the odds of solving a case jumped dramatically. Clinging to her last thread of hope, Susie nervously made the call. After hearing her story on the other end of the line, Brennan was moved, and he agreed without hesitation. His decision would become the turning point the case had been missing. When Brennan took over, he didn't rush to hunt for suspects. Instead, his first move was to sit down with Susie and ask her to replay the discovery again and again, searching for even the smallest detail that felt off. Susie went back through the scene in her mind, until one thing suddenly hit her. Greg's room had felt unusually hot and stuffy, and in Beaumont, September temperatures can still be brutal. Greg hated the heat. He'd had the same habit for years. He always kept the air conditioner set very low. So if the room was that warm, it likely meant only one thing. Greg hadn't been running the AC the night before, and that didn't make sense. Brennan immediately connected that detail to the power outage. He theorized that Greg probably did have the air conditioning on at first, but when the electricity went out, the unit shut off. The circuit was restored around 8:30 p.m., and the room may have still held some cool air, so Greg simply forgot to turn the AC back on. But based on Greg's personality and routine, Brennan reasoned that within an hour, once the room started heating up, Greg would have felt uncomfortable and turned it back on. So the only explanation for that stifling heat the next morning was chilling. Whatever happened to Greg most likely happened soon after the power came back. Then Brennan noticed something else. The cigarette in Greg's hand had burned down about halfway. That suggested Greg was killed suddenly, right there in the room. No attacker would beat someone elsewhere, carry the body back, and then take the time to light a cigarette and delicately place it between his fingers, like some theatrical final touch. And there was another odd detail. Greg was right-handed, yet the cigarette was in his left hand. To Brennan, that wasn't random. It looked like instinct. In the moment Greg sensed danger, he may have reflexively switched the cigarette to his left hand, freeing up his stronger right hand to push himself up, climb off the bed, and reach the door for help. But he never made it. He collapsed before he could get there. Based on everything he'd seen, Brennan became even more convinced this wasn't a simple accident. He reached out to local police and eventually persuaded them to reopen the investigation. Through the case file, Brennan learned that 3 electricians had been staying in the room next door. They had previously told investigators that sometime after midnight, they heard Greg coughing a few times from inside room 348. But based on the room temperature, that detail didn't add up. If Greg had really been alive that late, there was no way he would have left the air conditioner off. That contradiction suddenly made the 3 men look a lot more suspicious. By then, the electricians were no longer in Beaumont. They had returned home to Wisconsin. And because police didn't have direct evidence tying them to a crime, Brennan knew that showing up at their door to interrogate them would only spook them and shut everything down. So after discussing it with investigators, he chose a quieter, more indirect strategy. Instead of going after the 3 men head-on, he went after the people around them, their co-workers. At the time, many of the refinery workers were staying at the same hotel. It was a small world where people came and went constantly and rumors traveled fast. A bizarre, locked-room death, like Greg's, would have been the kind of story everyone talked about. And if there was any hidden truth, Brennan believed it might be buried inside those whispers. Working with a detective, Brennan began visiting and casually chatting with the workers, acting like he was simply making conversation, asking if they'd heard anything about the man who died in room 348. Most people knew nothing. But just when they were close to giving up, one co-worker let something slip. He said that on the night it happened, he thought he heard a gunshot. That single sentence snapped everything into focus, because if a bullet was small enough and entered the body at a strange angle, it might not leave an obvious trail at the scene. It could even be missed in an initial examination. But inside the body, it could still cause catastrophic internal damage. And suddenly, Greg's impossible injuries finally had an explanation. Brennan and a detective went back to the MCM Elegante Hotel to look for proof that a gunshot had been fired. Even though 8 full months had passed, they still conducted a painstaking re-examination of room 348. By then, countless guests had come and gone, and anything that belonged to Greg had long been cleared out. In a room that had been cleaned and reset over and over again, was there any chance they could still find something decisive? Just when they were about to lose hope, Brennan's eyes caught something on the wall behind the door, a tiny dent. During the initial investigation, police had assumed it was just damage from the doorknob hitting the wall, and no one paid it much attention. But Brennan didn't let it go. He pressed the door all the way back and realized something strange. The dent didn't line up with the doorknob at all, and even more unsettling, on the other side of that very wall was room 349, where the electricians had been staying. Brennan and the detective immediately entered room 349, and in the exact corresponding spot, they made a shocking discovery. There was also a small hole, crudely patched up with tissue and toothpaste, a sloppy attempt at repair. They carefully removed the material, revealing a round opening less than 1 centimeter wide. The two rooms were connected through that tiny hole. Brennan pulled out a laser pointer and shined it through. The beam passed straight into room 348, landing on the left side of the bed, the exact spot where Greg would have been lying that night. In that moment, they finally had the proof. Greg hadn't suffered a mysterious, locked-room death. He had been shot through the wall, and because there was no exit wound, the bullet had to still be inside Greg's body. Police rushed this new discovery back to the medical examiner who had performed the original autopsy. The examiner could hardly believe it. Even back then, he had been troubled by Greg's strange injuries, but he had ultimately labeled it as unexplained blunt force trauma. Since no one suspected a shooting at the time, no one had searched for a bullet, and the most critical piece of evidence had been missed. By then, Greg's body had already been cremated, but the autopsy records still existed, especially the photographs. So Brennan and investigators went back through those images with fresh eyes, and this time they stopped looking at the injuries as random, blunt force trauma. Instead, they traced the damage as a path. Starting from the small wound in his private area, the internal trauma formed a clear upward track through the abdominal cavity, damaging ribs and organs and reaching injuries near the heart. The pattern wasn't scattered or chaotic the way multiple blunt impacts usually are. It was consistent and directional, exactly what you'd expect if a single projectile had traveled through the body at an angle. That's when the realization hit them. The mark that had been misread as an odd, inexplicable injury wasn't a blunt force wound at all. It was an entry point. Brennan and the detective immediately flew to Wisconsin, where the three electricians had returned, determined to confront them one by one and reconstruct what really happened. They started with Tim Steinmetz. They asked him to describe everything he knew about that night, step by step. After going over his story repeatedly, Steinmetz signed a sworn statement. He thought it was just routine paperwork. Feeling relaxed, he repeated the same version he'd told police before. But just as he assumed the interview was ending, Brennan and the detective's tone suddenly changed. They told him flat out, if he didn't tell the truth, he could be arrested on the spot for making a false statement and obstructing justice. Under that pressure, Steinmetz finally broke and confessed what had really happened. That night, the three electricians had been drinking heavily in room 349, partying until they were completely wasted. At some point, the hotel suddenly went dark. A while later, the lights came back on, but the blackout didn't stop the party. They kept going. Then one of them, Lance Miller, pulled out a handgun, showing it off like a trophy. As the night went on and everyone got louder, Muller took it a step further. He racked the slide, and the gun discharged by accident. The bullet blasted straight through the wall and into the next room, room 348. The sudden bang sobered them up instantly. They froze, panicked, and pressed themselves against the wall, holding their breath, listening for any reaction next door. No screams, no shouting, nothing. They convinced themselves the bullet had only gone through the wall and hadn't hit anyone. They should have knocked on Greg's door. They should have checked, but they were terrified of getting in trouble, so they didn't. Instead, the three men hurriedly patched the hole with whatever they could find, toothpaste and tissues, a crude cover-up, and tried to pretend it never happened. And to calm their nerves, they made an absurd decision. They went right back downstairs and continued drinking at the bar, staying there until late into the night. It wasn't until the next day, when they heard Greg had been found dead, that they realized how serious it was. They immediately suspected he might have been struck by that bullet. But Muller, the one who had fired the gun, didn't come forward. He hid the handgun in his car and later handed it off to a friend to keep it out of sight. Then the autopsy report initially claimed Greg died from blunt force trauma. The three men took that as their lucky escape. They thought they'd gotten away with it. But they were wrong. Steinmetz still insisted that when they walked past room 348 in the early morning hours, he heard Greg coughing inside. Yet most experts agree that if a bullet had passed through the heart, surviving for 3 more hours would be extremely unlikely, meaning Steinmetz was almost certainly still lying. 9 months after Greg's death, the electrician who fired the shot, Lance Muller, was finally arrested. Because of everything that happened afterward, the lies, the cover-up, the attempts to hide the evidence, Muller was initially charged with murder. Prosecutors made one point very clear. If he had come forward the very next day and told the truth, he might never have faced a murder charge at all. Before the case reached sentencing, Muller's defense pushed hard to have the charge reduced. They argued it was a chain of terrible accidents, that Muller had no intent to kill, no motive, no plan. In the end, Muller was held responsible for Greg's death and received a 10-year prison sentence. As he was about to be taken away, Susie finally got the chance to speak to him. Fighting back tears, she told him this was about far more than an accidental discharge. She said, "You didn't intentionally seek him out to murder him, but you murdered him with every lie you told, with every intentional selfish deception, with every cover-up, over and over again." And Susie was right about one thing. If Investigator Brennan hadn't dug out the truth, Muller might never have confessed to anything. The case could have been filed away forever as a bizarre accident, an impossible mystery that no one could explain. Looking back now, this case is no different from so many other cold cases that were eventually solved. A blackout, the way the wall was built, a tiny bullet hole everyone overlooked, a rushed autopsy, a few careless lies, one coincidence stacked on top of another, until the truth was sealed shut. Before the puzzle was finally put together, it looked like a perfect locked room, eerie, unbelievable, almost supernatural. But once the clues were reassembled, the reality was painfully ordinary, almost absurd. There was no master plan, no brilliant killer, just alcohol, recklessness, fear, and then a long chain of selfish cover-ups. And maybe that's the cruelest part of cases like this. They don't seem mysterious because the truth is complicated. They seem mysterious because human cowardice and wishful thinking delay justice and bury the answer in plain sight.